In 1221, the largest army in the world arrived at the banks of the Indus River. Genghis Khan's Mongol forces had just destroyed Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, cities of hundreds of thousands. They had killed more people in a single campaign than the Black Death would kill in Europe a century later. On the other side of the river stood the Delhi Sultanate, a kingdom founded by a former slave, an army built from Central Asian mercenaries who had only recently converted to the rulers they now served. A political system so unstable that it would cycle through 5 separate dynasties in 320 years. The Mongols stopped. They did not cross. The Delhi Sultanate, a state that historians routinely describe as one of the most politically chaotic in medieval Asian history, turned back the most successful military force in human history, not once but repeatedly, across a century of attempted invasions. And then, having survived the Mongols, it destroyed itself from within through a sequence of coups, assassinations, and factional wars that left it so weakened that a single battle in 1526 ended it entirely. Archaeologists excavating the buried cities beneath modern Delhi, Lal Kot, Siri, Tughlaqabad, Jahanpana, have identified at least 7 distinct urban layers, each representing a different dynasty's capital, stacked one on top of another across a millennium of continuous habitation. The city that destroyed previous cities to build new ones on their ruins is the physical record of the Sultanate's political culture. Every ruler built something new, and every successor tore it down. So here is the question: how does the empire that stopped the Mongols manage to fail at stopping itself? The Indian subcontinent in the late 12th century was a political landscape of extraordinary fragmentation. The Rajput kingdoms that had dominated northern India for centuries, the Chahamanas of Ajmer, the Chandelas of Bundelkhand, the Paramaras of Malwa, were internally strong within their territories, but collectively incapable of coordinated defense against external threats. They competed with each other for prestige and territory, formed and dissolved alliances with a frequency that made any lasting political coalition impossible, and approached the question of external invasion through the lens of individual kingdom survival rather than collective security. Into this fragmented landscape came Muhammad of Ghor, a ruler of the Ghurid dynasty from what is now Afghanistan, whose repeated campaigns into northern India between 1175 and 1206 were the most successful foreign military incursion since the Arab invasions of Sind 5 centuries earlier. Muhammad of Ghor's military strategy was systematic where previous raiders had been episodic. He was not raiding for loot and withdrawing, but campaigning for territorial control, establishing garrisons, appointing administrators, and building the infrastructure of permanent occupation rather than temporary exploitation. The Rajput response was predictably fragmented. The Battle of Tarain in 1191, in which a Rajput coalition under Prithviraj Chahamana defeated Muhammad of Ghor and drove his forces back, suggested that coordinated resistance was possible. The Second Battle of Tarain in 1192 demonstrated that the coordination could not be maintained. Muhammad returned with a larger force and a modified tactical approach, and the Rajput coalition, unable to sustain the organizational effort required for a second major campaign, was decisively defeated. Prithviraj was captured and subsequently executed. The road to Delhi was open. The man Muhammad of Ghor left to govern his Indian conquests was Qutb-ud-Din Aibak, a Turkic slave who had been purchased as a child, educated in the arts of war and administration at the Ghurid court, and eventually appointed to senior military command on the basis of demonstrated ability rather than birth. The social system from which he came, the Ghulam institution, in which slave soldiers were trained as military professionals with personal loyalty to their master, was a specific form of military organization developed in the Islamic world that produced, paradoxically, some of the most capable military commanders of the medieval period. Slaves who were freed and elevated to command positions had personal incentives to perform that hereditary nobles, assured of their positions regardless of performance, often lacked. When Muhammad of Ghor was assassinated in in 1206 by Ismaili assassins during a prayer gathering, Qutb-ud-Din Aibak declared himself Sultan of the Delhi territories, not as a rebel or usurper, but as the senior military commander filling a political vacuum created by the assassination of his master. The Delhi Sultanate had begun, founded by a man who had been a slave and who now controlled the most strategically important city in northern India. The Delhi Sultanate's most remarkable structural characteristic was its multi-dynastic composition, 5 distinct ruling dynasties in 320 years, and understanding how this happened requires understanding the specific political logic of the Ghulam institution that founded the Sultanate and that shaped its political culture throughout its existence. The Mamluk dynasty, sometimes called the Slave Dynasty, that Qutb-ud-Din Aibak founded lasted from 1206 to 1290. It was not succeeded by a rival dynasty in the conventional sense of a competing royal family defeating the existing one in open warfare. It was succeeded by the Khilji dynasty through a coup in 1290 that replaced an aging and weakened Mamluk sultan with a more vigorous commander. The Khiljis were replaced by the Tughlaqs in 1320 through another coup. The Tughlaqs were replaced by the Sayyids, and they by the Lodis, in similar fashion. The Sultanate's political culture was, throughout its history, one in which the strongest commander, rather than the legitimate heir, held power, and in which the transfer of power was typically violent. The Qutb Minar, the most famous surviving monument of the Delhi Sultanate period, a 72, 5-meter minaret begun by Qutb-ud-Din Aibak and completed by subsequent sultans, is the physical record of this political succession in architectural form. The minaret's 5 stories were built by different rulers at different times, using slightly different architectural styles and decorative programs that reflect the changing aesthetic preferences and resources of successive builders. The archaeological analysis of the structure, conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India over multiple surveys beginning in the colonial period and continuing through the 21st century, has revealed construction phases that correspond to the documentary record of the Sultanate's successive rulers, a physical timeline of the dynasty's political history written in stone. The genetic evidence for the population of the Delhi Sultanate period has been studied through the analysis of skeletal remains from burial sites associated with medieval Delhi. The most significant findings come from research conducted at cemeteries dating to the Sultanate period in the Delhi region, which show a population with genetic signatures consistent with the mixing of Central Asian, Iranian, and South Asian ancestry that the historical record describes. The Turkish, Afghan, and Iranian military settlers who formed the ruling class of the Sultanate brought Central Asian genetic profiles into the Indian population. The North Indian agricultural and craft communities they governed retained predominantly South Asian profiles, and the populations that formed through intermarriage between these communities show the blended signatures of both. The historical sources for the Delhi Sultanate are unusually rich by medieval Asian standards. The court historian Ziauddin Barani, writing in the mid-14th century under Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, produced a history of the Sultanate from its founding. That is remarkable, both for its detail and for its willingness to criticize the rulers it describes. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who spent several years at the Delhi court in the 1330s and 1340s, left an account of the Sultanate society that is one of the most detailed observations of medieval Indian urban life available from any source. Delhi's geographic position, in the Gangetic Plain approximately 160 kilometers south of the Yamuna River's confluence with the Ganges at the eastern end of the passes through the Aravalli Hills, made it the natural capital of northern India for any powers seeking to govern the subcontinent's most productive agricultural region while defending against threats from the northwest. The Yamuna River, flowing southward through the Delhi region before joining the Ganges at Allahabad, provided both the city's primary water supply and a significant defensive barrier on its eastern flank. The Aravalli Hills, the ancient, weathered mountain range that extends through Rajasthan and into the Delhi region, created a series of defensible ridges on the south and southwest that successive Delhi sultans used as the foundation for their fortifications. The flat, agriculturally productive plains to the north and northeast were both the source of the agricultural revenue that sustained the city and the direction from which most military threats approached. The Doab, the land between the Yamuna and Ganges rivers, extending from the Delhi region to Allahabad, was the agricultural heartland of northern India, producing wheat, barley, and rice in quantities that made it the most valuable agricultural territory in the subcontinent. Control of the Doab meant control of the food supply for the dense populations of the Gangetic Plain and the Sultanate's agricultural administration. The Iqta system, in which the right to collect agricultural revenue from specific territories was assigned to military commanders in lieu of cash salaries, was organized around the management of this productive landscape, the specific defensive challenge that the Sultanate faced, and that shaped its military and administrative organization more than any other factor, was the Mongol threat from the northwest. The passes through the Hindu Kush and the plains of the Punjab provided the invasion routes that Mongol forces used in their repeated attempts to extend their conquests into the subcontinent, and the Delhi Sultanate's ability to maintain a military establishment capable of defending these approaches against the most effective army in the world determined whether the Sultanate survived. The architectural response to this threat, the ring of fortified cities around Delhi, whose ruins are still visible in the modern city's landscape, was one of the most ambitious programs of military construction in medieval Asian history. Lal Kot, the oldest of these fortifications, was built by the Tomara Rajputs before the Sultanate period. Kila Rai Pithora was built by the last Chahamana ruler and captured by the Ghurids. Siri Fort was built by Alauddin Khalji specifically to defend against Mongol raids. Tughlaqabad was built by Ghiyath al-Din Tughlaq. Each of these fortified cities, most of them now partially excavated and partially preserved as archaeological parks within the modern urban landscape, represents a specific response to the specific military threats of its period. The territorial expansion of the Delhi Sultanate from a regional power controlling the Delhi region and the upper Gangetic Plain to an empire claiming suzerainty over most of the Indian subcontinent occurred in stages across the 13th and 14th centuries, driven by the combined incentives of military ambition, revenue extraction, and the specific political logic of the Ghulam military establishment. The Mamluk sultans of the 13th century consolidated control over northern India, extending the Sultanate's authority through the Gangetic Plain into Bengal in the east, and westward through the Punjab to the natural frontier of the Indus River. The campaigns were as much administrative as military, establishing Iqta assignments for the military commanders who held territory in exchange for maintaining troops, appointing qazis to administer Islamic law in the urban centers, and negotiating tributary relationships with the Hindu kingdoms that were too distant or too strong for direct military subordination. The Khilji dynasty, which came to power in 1290, represented the first significant expansion of the Sultanate's political base beyond the narrow Turkish military aristocracy that had founded and dominated it. Jalal-ud-Din Khalji, the dynasty's founder, was Afghan rather than Turkish, a distinction that the existing Turkish military aristocracy found threatening, and that contributed to the factional resistance his dynasty faced. His nephew and successor Alauddin Khalji was the most militarily and administratively capable ruler the Sultanate produced, and his reign from 1296 to 1316 represents the period of the Sultanate's greatest geographic reach and most effective governance. Alauddin Khalji's southern campaigns, the expeditions that penetrated the Deccan Plateau and reached the southernmost tip of India, were conducted by his most capable commander, Malik Kafur, a military slave of Hindu birth who had converted to Islam and risen to effective second-in-command of the empire's forces. The campaigns of 1307 to 1313 looted the treasuries of the Yadava, Kakatiya, and Hoysala kingdoms, bringing back to Delhi wealth in gold, elephants, and horses of a scale that contemporary accounts describe in terms that modern historians find, if anything, understated when cross-referenced with the archaeological evidence of the temples and palaces that were plundered. The administrative reforms that Alauddin Khalji implemented during his reign were as significant as his military campaigns and were directly motivated by the fiscal requirements of maintaining a military establishment capable of defeating the Mongols. His price control edicts, which fixed the prices of grain, cloth, cattle, and other commodities at specific rates and established a system of market supervisors to enforce compliance, were one of the most ambitious economic interventions in medieval history. Their purpose was to allow the Sultanate to maintain a large, professional army at fixed salaries in silver coin without the inflation that would otherwise have made those salaries inadequate as market prices rose. The military organization of the Delhi Sultanate was, throughout its history, built around a specific combination of the Central Asian cavalry tradition, fast-moving horsemen trained from childhood in mounted archery and shock, tactics, and the South Asian war elephant tradition, whose psychological and physical impact on infantry formations remained significant, despite the development of effective countermeasures. The Mongol invasions that the Sultanate faced repeatedly between 1221 and 1303 tested this military system to its absolute limits, and in so doing shaped its development in ways that made it uniquely capable in the specific operational environment of the northwestern frontier. The Sultanate's victories against the Mongols, and they were genuine military victories, not merely the Mongols' choice to withdraw, were achieved through a combination of defensive fortification, the maintenance of a large enough mobile cavalry force to contest the Mongols in open battle when necessary, and the specific tactical adaptations that the Sultanate's commanders developed through decades of combat experience against the most capable enemy they faced. The Battle of Kili in 1299 was the most significant of the Sultanate's anti-Mongol victories. A Mongol force of approximately 200 Zeros cavalry, the largest invasion yet attempted, entered the Punjab and advanced on Delhi. Alauddin Khalji marched to meet them with the Sultanate's main army rather than retreating behind the city's defences, a choice that demonstrated the confidence he had in his forces and in his own military judgment. The battle, fought near the present-day town of Kili, was a direct engagement between two large armies in open terrain. The Sultanate's army won. The Mongol force withdrew. It was one of the few occasions in medieval Asian history when the Mongol army had been defeated in a pitched battle by a non-Mongol force. The specific tactical factors that produced this outcome have been analysed by military historians using both the surviving textual accounts and the comparative evidence of other anti-Mongol campaigns in the medieval period. The consensus is the Sultanate's success rested on three elements: the quality of its cavalry, which had been recruited and trained specifically to contest Mongol horse archer tactics; the intelligent use of war elephants in specific tactical roles where their mass could disrupt Mongol cavalry formations; and Alauddin Khalji's personal command ability, which maintained the coherence of his forces under the pressure of Mongol encirclement tactics. The Mamluk soldiers, the slave soldiers, who formed the professional core of the Sultanate's military, were, individually, among the most skilled military professionals of the medieval world. The Ghulam system's emphasis on lifelong martial training, personal loyalty to the commander who had purchased and elevated them, and the specific military culture that surrounded combat service in the Islamic world produced soldiers whose motivation and technical skill were consistently remarked upon by contemporaries. Their weakness was institutional rather than individual. The same personal loyalty that made them effective soldiers made the army's cohesion, dependent on their relationship to specific commanders, and the deaths or political falls of those commanders could, and repeatedly did, disintegrate military units that had been formidable under their original leadership. The rulers of the Delhi Sultanate ranged from genuinely capable administrators, whose policies shaped Indian history for centuries, to rulers whose combination of personal cruelty and political incompetence accelerated the Sultanate's decline. Understanding both extremes and the specific circumstances that produced each is essential to understanding how the Sultanate survived as long as it did, and why it eventually failed. Alauddin Khalji is the most complex figure in the Sultanate's history and the most difficult to assess by any simple moral standard. By the testimony of every contemporary source, including the court historian Barani, who admired him and criticized him simultaneously. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence, military capability, and administrative effectiveness, who governed through a combination of genuine competence and systematic terror. He executed potential rivals without hesitation, including members of his own family. He maintained a network of spies in the markets, the military camps, and the noble households whose reports kept him informed of any conspiracy against his authority. He was not personally cruel in the way that some rulers are. He did not torture for entertainment or kill for display. He killed for political security, with the cold calculation of someone who understood that the Sultanate's internal political environment made the elimination of potential rivals a survival requirement. His economic policies, the price control system, the military salary reforms, the land revenue restructuring, were the most significant administrative innovations in the Sultanate's history, and were genuinely effective at achieving their objectives during his reign. The price control system held grain prices at artificially low levels for over a decade, allowing the Sultanate to maintain its large army without the crushing taxation that market price salaries would have required. When the system was relaxed after his death, the inflationary pressures that had been suppressed immediately manifested, demonstrating both the effectiveness of the controls during his reign and their dependence on his personal political authority for enforcement. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled from 1325 to 1351, is the most debated ruler in the Sultanate's history, a man described by Ibn Battuta, who served at his court as simultaneously the most just and the most unjust, the most generous and the most violent of all the rulers Ibn Battuta had encountered in his decades of travel. His ambitions were, by any assessment, extraordinary. He attempted to establish a new capital at Dawlatabad in the Deccan, forcing the entire population of Delhi to relocate. He introduced a token currency to replace silver coinage. He launched military expeditions against territories in Central Asia that were beyond any realistic logistical reach. The capital relocation project, moving the imperial court from Delhi to Dawlatabad, approximately 100 kilometers to the south, is the most discussed example of the gap between Muhammad bin Tughlaq's strategic vision and his ability to implement. The logic was defensible. A capital in the Deccan would be more centrally located relative to the empire's full territorial extent and less vulnerable to the Mongol threat. The execution was catastrophic, forcing the entire population of a city of perhaps 1 million people to relocate over a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers through terrain that stretched the supply infrastructure of the medieval period to breaking point, resulted in deaths from exhaustion, disease, and the disruption of the agricultural and commercial systems that had sustained Delhi. When Muhammad bin Tughlaq reversed the decision and ordered the population to return, the death toll of the round trip was enormous, and the resentment generated was permanent. For the majority of the population living within the Delhi Sultanate's territory, the farmers of the Gangetic Plain, the craftsmen and merchants of the cities, the soldiers and administrators of the military and civil establishments, daily life was shaped by the combination of agricultural rhythms, tax obligations, and the specific social arrangements that the Sultanate's governance imposed on an Indian society that was, in its religious and cultural foundations, overwhelmingly Hindu. The agricultural population of northern India in the Sultanate period lived under the Ikta system, the assignment of revenue collection rights from specific territories to military commanders who were responsible for maintaining troops from those revenues. The Iqtidar, the holder of an Ikta, was not a landlord in the European feudal sense. He did not own the land and could not pass his rights to his children as a matter of right. His assignment could be transferred or revoked by the Sultan, but in practice, the distance between the Delhi court and the provincial territories meant that Iqtidars exercised considerable discretion in how they managed their assignments, and the potential for abuse, extraction beyond the prescribed rates, failure to maintain the military obligations the Iqta was supposed to fund, was substantial and frequently realized. The urban population of Delhi itself, which Ibn Battuta, writing in the 1340s, estimated as one of the largest cities in the world, was a cosmopolitan mixture of Turkic, Afghan, Iranian, and Indian communities whose daily interactions were shaped by the social hierarchies of the Sultanate period. The ruling Turkish and Afghan military aristocracy lived in the areas around the court. The Iranian scholarly and administrative class, whose Persian literacy was indispensable for the Sultanate's documentary and diplomatic functions, occupied the professional middle of the social hierarchy. The Hindu merchant and craft communities maintained their occupational specializations and their neighborhood-level social organizations largely intact, adapting to the requirements of Muslim political authority without abandoning their religious and cultural practices. The food culture of the Sultanate period was one of the most significant and lasting contributions of this era to the longer history of Indian civilization. The introduction of Central Asian and Iranian cooking traditions, the pilaf, the kebab, the naan bread, the tandoor oven, the use of dried fruits and nuts in savory dishes, into the Indian culinary environment created a fusion tradition that became the foundation of what we now call Mughal cuisine, and that defines Indian restaurant food across the world today. The specific dishes that trace their origin to the Sultanate period include versions of biryani, various forms of skewered and roasted meat, and the bread traditions of northern India, whose techniques were brought by the Afghan and Central Asian settlers who accompanied the military establishment. The plague epidemics that struck the Delhi Sultanate's territory, particularly the catastrophic Black Death that reached India by the mid-14th century, had significant demographic consequences that the Sultanate's administrative capacity was inadequate to manage. Ibn Battuta's account of the Black Death's impact on the subcontinent, though limited in geographic specificity, describes mass mortality in the urban populations and the disruption of agricultural labor that caused food shortages in the following years. The physical character of Delhi under the Sultanate period was defined by a pattern unique in world urban history: the construction of successive new capitals, each built as a deliberate expression of dynastic legitimacy and power, typically on sites adjacent to but distinct from the previous capital. The result was a metropolitan area of extraordinary archaeological density, layers of urban occupation representing each dynasty's building program, each visible today as a distinct archaeological park within the continuous urban fabric of modern Delhi. The Cube complex, centered on the Qutub Minar and the Mosque of Qatul Islam, the Might of Islam, was the first major building project of the Sultanate period and the most symbolically charged. The mosque was built on the site of a destroyed Hindu temple, using materials, columns, decorative elements, architectural members removed from the temple and from 27 other Hindu and Jain temples in the vicinity. The reuse of temple materials in mosque construction was not simply pragmatic recycling. It was a deliberate symbolic act, demonstrating the replacement of one religious political order by another. The columns that support the mosque's colonnades are visibly Hindu in style, their Hindu sculptural programs incompletely defaced, creating a visual palimpsest that is simultaneously an Islamic monument and a record of the Hindu temples it replaced. Siri Fort, built by Alauddin Khalji as a specifically military response to the Mongol threat, covered approximately 450 hectares within its walls and was designed to shelter the entire population of Delhi during a siege. The hydraulic engineering that supplied water to this enclosed city was, by the account of medieval sources, sophisticated and reliable, a system of underground channels, reservoirs, and distribution points that could sustain a large population through an extended siege. The archaeological investigation of the Siri Fort area, conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India through multiple field seasons, has confirmed the presence of extensive underground hydraulic infrastructure whose full extent has not been completely mapped. The multiple cities of medieval Delhi, whose remains are distributed across the modern metropolitan area, have been the subject of increasingly systematic archaeological investigation since the 1980s, and the picture that is emerging from this work is of an urban landscape of greater complexity, greater population density, and greater commercial sophistication than the fragmentary above-ground remains would suggest. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of several of the fort complexes have identified subsurface structures, building foundations, cisterns, underground passages, whose extent and character significantly revise the understanding of the original urban fabric. The religious life of the Delhi Sultanate was defined by the specific challenge of Muslim political authority, governing a predominantly Hindu population, a challenge whose management required both the practical accommodation of religious diversity and the maintenance of the Islamic legitimacy that justified the Sultanate's political existence in the eyes of its ruling class. The formal Islamic political theory that the Sultanate's scholars and administrators worked within required Muslim rulers to maintain and enforce Islamic law, protect the Muslim community, and extend the domain of Islam. The practical reality of governing a subcontinent in which the vast majority of the population, perhaps 90%, was Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain required significant accommodation of non-Muslim religious practice. The specific form this accommodation took in the Sultanate period, the toleration of Hindu temples, the continuation of Hindu religious festivals, the employment of Hindu officials in the civil administration, was not ideologically comfortable for the more rigorous Islamic scholars of the period, and the tension between the requirements of Muslim political theory and the realities of governing a diverse population was a persistent theme in the Sultanate's intellectual and political life. The Sufi tradition, the mystical dimension of Islamic religious practice that emphasized personal experience of the divine, the cultivation of spiritual states through meditation and devotion, and the transcendence of formal religious boundaries, was the most significant Islamic cultural force in the development of Indian Islam and in the relationship between the Muslim ruling establishment and the Hindu majority population. The Sufi masters who settled India from the 12th century onward established khanqahs, spiritual hospices where students could pursue Sufi training and where ordinary people could receive blessings, participate in devotional music, and seek intercession with the divine. That became among the most important social institutions in the Sultanate's cities. The Chishti order, the Sufi lineage most prominent in the Delhi Sultanate period, was particularly significant because of its specific approach to popular religious practice. The Chishti masters, most notably Nizamuddin Auliya, whose shrine at Nizamuddin in Delhi remains one of the most visited Sufi shrines in the world, taught an approach to spiritual devotion that was accessible across religious and social lines. The Qawwali musical tradition, the devotional music associated with Chishti practice, which developed at the Delhi court of Nizamuddin Auliya and his disciple, was one of the most creative artistic syntheses of the period, combining Persian poetic forms, Indian musical traditions, and Arabic spiritual content in a form of devotional expression that attracted both Muslim and Hindu participants. The relationship between the Sufi masters and the Sultanate's political rulers was complex and sometimes tense. The The sultans sought the blessing and legitimation that association with recognized Sufi masters provided. The Sufi masters maintained their independence. Nizamuddin Aulia's refusal to meet with the sultans who sought his favor was understood at the time and has been understood since as a deliberate statement that spiritual authority was independent of political authority. The technological achievements of the Delhi Sultanate period were significant in several areas, though they have received less scholarly attention than the more dramatic military and political history of the era. Partly because the Sultanate's documentary tradition focused on political and religious matters, rather than on the technical and practical knowledge that historians of science find most interesting. The iron technology of the Delhi Sultanate period was, by contemporary global standards, genuinely advanced. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, a 7-meter tall pillar of wrought iron dating to the Gupta period, approximately 1,600 years old, standing within the Qutub complex, is the most famous artifact of Indian metallurgical achievement, celebrated for its resistance to corrosion despite exposed to Delhi's climate for 16 centuries. While the pillar predates the Sultanate by nearly a millennium, its presence in the Sultanate's symbolic centre and its continued maintenance during the Sultanate period reflect the continuity of Indian metalworking traditions that the Sultanate incorporated and developed. The military application of technology that the Sultanate developed specifically in response to the Mongol threat deserves attention. The Greek fire-type incendiary weapons used in the defense of Delhi's fortifications against Mongol siege operations, documented in the chronicles of the period, represented a specific technological adaptation to the specific tactical challenge that siege warfare posed. The use of naphtha-based incendiaries in the defense of fortified positions was drawn from the broader Islamic military technological tradition, but its specific application in the Delhi context reflected the accumulated experience of the Sultanate's commanders, with what worked and what did not against Mongol siege techniques. The water technology of the Sultanate period was sophisticated and had lasting consequences for northern Indian hydraulic infrastructure. The stepwells, the baoli, of the Sultanate period, several of which survive in the Delhi region, were engineered structures of considerable complexity that combined the functions of water storage, water extraction, and public gathering space in a single architectural form. The Agrasan Ki Baoli, the Rajon Ki Baoli, and several other surviving stepwells in Delhi represent the Sultanate period development of a water management tradition that extended back centuries in Indian history and that the Sultanate's engineers refined with new construction techniques and larger scales. The astronomical knowledge of the Sultanate period was transmitted through the Persian language scientific tradition that the Sultanate's Iranian scholarly community maintained, drawing on the accumulated astronomical learning of the Islamic world. The astronomical instruments, astrolabes, celestial globes, and the specialized devices for determining prayer times and the direction of Mecca that the Sultanate's craftsmen produced were of quality comparable to the best contemporary Islamic astronomical instrumentation. The Jantar Mantar observatories built in Delhi and other Indian cities in the 18th century, which are better-known examples of Indian astronomical instrumentation, draw on a tradition of careful astronomical observation that the Sultanate period sustained and developed. The Delhi Sultanate's survival across 320 years of continuous external and internal threats is one of the most remarkable instances of political persistence in medieval Asian history, and understanding how it managed this survival helps explain why, when the Sultanate finally failed, it failed so completely and so quickly. The Mongol threat was the defining external challenge for most of the Sultanate's first century. Between 1221 and 1306, the Mongols launched approximately 17 significant invasions of India, ranging from raids into the Punjab to major campaigns that reached Delhi itself. The Sultanate repelled all of them, the specific combination of factors that made these repulses possible. The quality of the Sultanate's cavalry, the defensive infrastructure of the fortified cities around Delhi, The tactical adaptations of commanders who had spent careers fighting Mongols, and the specific geographic advantages of the Indus-Punjab frontier that provided both warning time and defensive depth, was not achieved by accident. It was the product of deliberate military investment sustained over generations in response to a threat whose seriousness the Sultanate's rulers fully understood. The Mongol invasions did not cease because the Mongols gave up on India. They ceased because the Mongol Empire itself fragmented in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. The Ilkhanate of Persia and the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, whose territories included the invasion routes into India, became preoccupied with their own internal conflicts and external threats rather than with the Indian frontier. The Delhi Sultanate benefited from the Mongol Empire's dissolution without having caused it, and the reduction of the Mongol threat in the early 14th century removed the external pressure that had been, paradoxically, one of the forces holding the Sultanate together. The Timurid invasion of 1398, Timur's campaign that sacked Delhi and killed hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants, was the most devastating single event in the Sultanate's history, and the one from which it never fully recovered. Timur's account of the campaign, preserved in his own memoirs, describes the sack of Delhi with a clinical precision whose the death toll he records, approximately 100,000 civilians killed in a single day, reflects the deliberate policy of terror that Timurid campaigns employed. The city was depopulated, its craft industries destroyed, its accumulated wealth looted, and its food supply disrupted in ways that produced famine and disease in the subsequent years. When Timur withdrew to Samarkand, he left behind a sultanate that was politically intact but economically and demographically devastated. The internal enemies, the court factions, the ambitious military commanders, the provincial governors who exploited central weakness to establish effective autonomy, were in many ways more dangerous than the external ones because they were continuous and cumulative, where the external threats were periodic. Every succession crisis produced both military and administrative disruption. Every transition of power between dynasties was accompanied by purges, realignments, and the renegotiation of the patronage relationships that held the political system together. The energy and resources consumed by these internal conflicts were continuously diverted from the external defense and administrative development that the Sultanate needed to sustain itself. The Delhi Sultanate, at its territorial maximum, approximately during the reign of Alauddin Khalji from 296 to 1316, controlled more of the Indian subcontinent than any previous Muslim ruler, and, by some measures, more than any ruler since Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. The empire stretched from the Indus River in the northwest to the Tamil country at the southern tip of the peninsula, encompassing the major agricultural regions, the commercial cities, and the trade routes that made northern India one of the wealthiest regions in the medieval world. The wealth that this territory generated through agricultural taxation, commercial duties, tribute payments from subordinate kingdoms, and the loot of military campaigns was, at the Sultanate's peak, comparable to the revenues of the major states of the contemporary Islamic world. The Chinese traveller Zhao Rugua, writing in the early 13th century, identified India as one of the world's primary sources of cotton textiles, spices, and precious stones, all of which passed through the commercial infrastructure of the Delhi region on their way to international markets. The Sultanate's control of the northern subcontinent's trade routes gave it a commercial leverage that supplemented its military and administrative power. The political relationship between the Sultanate and the non-Muslim kingdoms of the subcontinent was complex and varied by region and period. In the north, where the Sultanate's military dominance was most complete, the Rajput kingdoms had been reduced to tributary status, maintaining their internal autonomy in exchange for acknowledging the Sultan's suzerainty and paying periodic tribute. In the south, where the military campaigns of Malik Kafur had demonstrated the Sultanate's capacity to project force without establishing permanent occupation, The relationship was more like extortion than governance. The southern kingdoms paid tribute after military campaigns without becoming integrated into the Sultanate's administrative system. The cultural production of the Sultanate's peak period was substantial and diverse. Persian language literature flourished at the Delhi court, with poets and scholars who produced works in the ghazal, qasida, and masnavi forms that drew on the full tradition of classical Persian literature while incorporating specifically Indian themes and experiences. The musician and poet Amir Khusrau, who spent his career at the Delhi court under multiple sultans from the late 13th to the early 14th century, was one of the most creative cultural figures of the medieval Islamic world, developing new musical forms, composing poetry in both Persian and Hindi, and serving as the cultural bridge between the Iranian and Indian traditions that the Sultanate brought together. The century between Timur's sack of Delhi in 1398 and the First Battle of Panipat in 1526 was one of progressive political fragmentation, economic stagnation, and military decline that turned a once dominant empire into a regional power struggling to maintain control of its immediate hinterland. The Sayyid dynasty that filled the political vacuum after Timur's invasion, claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima, a genealogy whose validity was accepted partly because no competing claim was strong enough to displace it, never recovered the territorial extent or political authority of the Sultanate's peak period. The Sayyid sultans governed Delhi and its immediate surroundings, while the provinces that had constituted the empire's territorial base established independent sultanates, Jaunpur in the east, Malwa and Gujarat in the west, the Bahmani Sultanate in the Deccan. The Delhi Sultanate's territory, once encompassing most of the subcontinent, contracted to a fraction of its former extent. The Lodi dynasty that replaced the Sayyids in 1451 represented the last genuine attempt to restore the Delhi Sultanate's former power. Ibrahim Lodi, the last sultan who ruled from 1517 to 1526, was a ruler of some military ability but catastrophic political judgment, whose determination to reduce the power of the Afghan nobility that formed the Sultanate's military backbone alienated the commanders, whose loyalty was the Sultanate's most essential resource. The specific mechanism of the Sultanate's final betrayal was a letter. Daulat Khan Lodi, the governor of Punjab, one of the most powerful nobles in the Sultanate, invited Babur, the Timurid ruler of Kabul, to invade India. Babur had been looking for an opportunity to expand into the subcontinent for years. The invitation gave him both the political justification and the military intelligence. Information about the Sultanate's troop dispositions, the loyalty of specific commanders, and the specific vulnerabilities of Ibrahim Lodi's position that transformed an ambition into a plan. The First Battle of Panipat on April 21, 1526, lasted approximately 8 hours and ended the Delhi Sultanate. Babur's force of approximately 0 soldiers, smaller than Ibrahim Lodi's army of perhaps 100,000, won through two specific advantages: field artillery, which the Sultanate's forces did not possess, and the tactical formation called the Lugma, which enveloped the flanks of Ibrahim Lodi's larger force and prevented it from using its numerical superiority effectively. The artillery was decisive in a specific way. Ibrahim Lodi's war elephants, the traditional battlefield weapon of the Indian military establishment, panicked under the noise and concussion of Babur's cannon fire, turned and ran back through the Sultanate's own infantry formations. The psychological weapon that had been the Sultanate's most intimidating battlefield asset became, in a few minutes of concentrated artillery fire, the instrument of its own destruction. Ibrahim Lodi died on the battlefield. His death was confirmed by Babur's forces, who identified his body among the dead, a fact that Babur recorded in his remarkable memoir, the Baburnama, which remains one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of medieval military action available from any source. The death of the Sultan in battle, without an heir or a clear successor, meant that there was no political core around which resistance could organize. The nobles who might have contested Babur's subsequent advance on Delhi had either been killed at Panipat, had already defected to Babur before the battle, or lacked the political standing to claim independent authority in the chaos of the Sultanate's collapse. The Mughal Empire that Babur founded, which became, in subsequent generations under Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, one of the greatest empires in world history, was built directly on the administrative, military, and cultural foundations that the Delhi Sultanate had established. The Ikta revenue system was retained and refined. The Persian administrative language was maintained. The synthesis of Iranian, Central Asian, and Indian cultural traditions that the Sultanate had begun developing was continued and deepened. The Mughal Empire was, in a fundamental sense, the Delhi Sultanate's successor, inheriting not just its territory but its institutions, its cultural patterns, and the social relationships that 3 centuries of Sultanate governance had created. The physical monuments of the Delhi Sultanate, the Qutub Minar, the tombs of the sultans, the stepwells, the fragments of the successive fortified cities, are distributed across the modern Delhi metropolitan area, preserved to varying degrees by the Archaeological Survey of India and by the World Heritage designation that the Qutub complex received in 1993. They are among the most visited historical sites in India, drawing millions of visitors annually, most of whom have limited awareness of the specific political and cultural history that produced them. The Delhi Sultanate ended in 1526, but its physical, cultural, and institutional legacy has shaped Indian civilization continuously from that moment to the present. The specific forms of that legacy are, in several respects, more significant and more visible than the legacy of any other medieval Indian dynasty, because the Sultanate was the institution that first created the administrative, cultural, and linguistic frameworks within which subsequent Indian history unfolded. The most direct physical legacy is the urban landscape of Delhi itself. The multiple cities of the Sultanate period, Lal Kot, Kila Rai Pithora, Siri, Tughlaqabad, Jahanpana, Firozabad, and the Lodi period developments form the historical foundation of one of the world's most populous metropolitan areas. The Archaeological Survey of India's ongoing work at these sites, excavation, conservation, and the increasingly systematic use of remote sensing and ground-penetrating radar to map the subsurface urban fabric continues to reveal the complexity of the medieval urban environment that is now buried beneath or incorporated into the modern city. The Qutub complex, designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1993, is the best preserved and most extensively studied portion of the Sultanate's architectural legacy. The ongoing conservation work at the site has produced detailed information about construction techniques, material properties, and design intentions that revises the understanding of medieval Islamic architecture in the Indian context. The specific mortared stone construction of the Qutub Minar, whose mortar composition has been analyzed by materials scientists and found to have specific performance characteristics that explain its durability over 8 centuries of thermal cycling and monsoon weathering, is a case study in the practical engineering knowledge embedded in medieval construction practice. The genetic evidence for the population history of the Sultanate period has been studied through both ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains from burial sites and population genetics, studies of contemporary Indian populations. The findings are consistent with the historical record's account of significant Central Asian migration into the Delhi region during the Sultanate period. The Turkish, Afghan, and Iranian settlers, whose descendants remain as distinct communities in Delhi and northern India today, combined with the predominantly South Asian genetic profile of the majority population that was governed by, but did not intermarry extensively with the ruling military class. The linguistic legacy of the Sultanate period is perhaps its most universally present contribution to contemporary life. The Hindustani language, which developed into the cities of the Delhi Sultanate as a contact language between the Persian-speaking ruling class and the Hindi-speaking majority population, is the direct ancestor of both modern standard Hindi and Urdu, the official languages of India and Pakistan respectively. The Persian-derived vocabulary of Hindi and Urdu, the words for government, administration, commerce, and the material culture of the medieval city, entered these languages through the Sultanate period contact that created Hindustani. When a speaker of Hindi or Urdu uses words like bazaar, darwaza, dukan, or hazar, market, door, shop, thousand, they are speaking a vocabulary that the Delhi Sultanate created through the daily interaction of Persian-speaking rulers and Hindi-speaking subjects. The question that the Delhi Sultanate most directly poses to the present is not about religious tolerance or cultural synthesis. The Sultanate's record on both is genuinely mixed, and the selective use of its history to argue for either a modern Hindu nationalism or modern Islamic identity politics involves simplifications that the historical record does not support. The question it poses is institutional. How does a state that has survived its most dangerous external threats, the Mongols, the Timurids, the repeated succession crises, manage to remain incapable of building the institutional depth that would allow it to survive the departure of capable individual rulers? The Sultanate survived the Mongols through the personal military genius of Alauddin Khalji and the accumulated tactical knowledge of 3 generations of commanders who had fought Mongols continuously. When Alauddin died, his price control system collapsed within months. When the capable commanders died, their tactical knowledge died with them. The Sultanate never developed the institutional mechanisms, the military academies, the documented tactical doctrine, the administrative procedures that codified best practices, that would have allowed it to sustain the capabilities that individual genius had created. This is the lesson that historians of institutions find most clearly expressed in the Sultanate's history, that the difference between a civilization that survives the departure of its greatest leaders and one that collapses with them is the existence of institutions that are stronger than any individual. The Sultanate had brilliant individuals. It never built institutions that outlasted them. Qutb Minar still stands. The iron pillar in its courtyard has not rusted in 1600 years. The stepwells still hold water. And somewhere beneath the streets of South Delhi, the walls of Siri Fort are slowly yielding their secrets to the archaeologists, who probe them with radar and excavate them with brushes. The Sultanate is gone. What it built remains. And what it failed to build, the institutions that would have made it permanent, remains the most instructive absence in its entire extraordinary story.